Hi, I'm Lois Weinberg, professor at California State University, Los Angeles. The title of my presentation is Multi-Agency Partnership to Improve Equity After Juvenile Detention. The contents of this presentation were developed by me for the purpose of this particular conference. And the contents do not necessarily represent the policy of the Department of Education, and you should not assume endorsement by the federal government. So let me give you a little bit of background. So there certainly are current issues of concern related to youth who are involved with the juvenile justice system. We've been concerned for a while about the school to prison pipeline, and particularly that it is disproportionately populated by low income youth of color, particularly youth who are African American, and also youth who are identified for special education services. Involvement with the juvenile justice system is associated with lower academic achievement and other outcomes such as employment as well. Certainly, youth who have been incarcerated face tremendous obstacles sometimes when released back into the community. And recidivism is higher for youth who are eligible for special education, and again, youth of color, particularly those who are African American. And there's been little research on recently released incarcerated youth, those who have been incarcerated and then are released back into the community. Little research related to their academic achievement, their employment outcomes, and certainly their high school graduation. So I'm going to tell you about a partnership that LA County was involved in. We were selected as one of 16 partnerships throughout the United States. This was an initiative of the U.S. Department of Education, particularly Career and Technical Education and the Office of Special Education Programs, and it was a technical assistance initiative. The goals of this particular initiative were to improve education and work outcomes of older youth and young adults in the justice system, with the ultimate goal of trying to reduce recidivism. So for our partnership, the LA County partnership, it included a public university, Cal State LA, the Charter College of Education, and particularly the Division of Special Education and Counseling, a local education agency, Los Angeles County Office of Education, and LACO, Los Angeles County Office of Education, provides education to youth who are detained in our juvenile halls and other detention facilities within the county. The other county agencies that were involved in our partnership were the Los Angeles County Probation Department, particularly the part of the department that was over residential treatment services, Los Angeles County Department of Mental Health, and they were involved, they are involved with this population having to do with screening, evaluation, and mental health treatment. And then we also had and were required to have a workforce development agency. And Los Angeles County has a workforce development, aging, and community services agency that deals with job preparedness, work experience, and job placement. And they partner with some other agencies, workforce development agencies in the Los Angeles community, American Job Center of California. So our partnership started meeting regularly from April 2018 through December 2020. We were assigned a coach to work with us from RTI, or Research Triangle Institute, and we attended 3 convenings with all 16 partnerships present. 2 were in Washington, D.C., and the 3rd was held remotely because the pandemic had started. So what our partnership decided to do was to focus on older youth and young adults in our county juvenile camps. We have 7 county juvenile camps throughout Los Angeles County, and these are facilities where older youth and young adults are detained, essentially incarcerated, for between 5 to 7 months or 7 to 9 months. And they have all committed crimes as juveniles or have violated their conditions of probation. We selected certain goals for our particular partnership that were aligned with the overall initiative. We wanted the youth to graduate from high school, right? So those were particularly 17 and 18-year-olds. We wanted them enrolled in school, but with a particular focus on either attaining a high school diploma or an equivalency. For those who were 18 years and older, we had a focus on employment. So we wanted them referred to the Workforce Development Agency, for them to enroll in the American Job Center of California, which are agencies throughout the community that would help them attain jobs. We had timelines for this, for the referrals, 1 to 2 days. And again, for those who had received a certain level of acceptable behavior while they were detained in the camps. And then ultimately, we wanted the population that we were focusing on to attain employment, regular, unsubsidized employment. And we set a goal of 45% of the youth that we were focusing on. As you will see, that turned out to be wildly unrealistic. So let me give you a little bit of background about our juvenile camps. They offer a lot of services within them. These are just some. There are multidisciplinary team meetings, which I'll go into a little bit more later. Their school is provided at each of them. For those who need mental health services, they are available through our County Department of Mental Health. There's a behavior management system, and those who are at a high enough level in the behavior management system, they are then eligible for what is called personal enrichment training, or PET. And these are sort of soft employment skills. They have to do with financial literacy, work ethics, setting goals for work, and career expectations. And then there's also the availability, once the youth and young adults in the camps receive the 20 hours of personal enrichment training, they're then eligible for paid employment within the juvenile camps. And that's up to 100 hours, and it's paid at minimum wage, which in California, minimum wage, it is $13.25 that the youth can receive. At the point that they're ready to be released from the juvenile camps and transition back to the community, Then there are counselors from our local education agency. There are transition counselors from our Los Angeles County Office of Education. And why these are necessary is because the youth then may go back to one of 81 school districts within Los Angeles County. We're obviously a very large urban county. There also are probation officers that would be assigned to them that are considered aftercare probation officers. I've talked about there's the workforce development representatives that they would be connected to, and then they would be referred as needed to mental health services. Once they're back in the community, they would continue with supervision by probation officers. They'd be expected to be enrolled in school unless they had graduated or received a high school equivalency diploma. They would be eligible for work experience, and then ultimately job placement and mentoring. There'd be some home-based support for them and their families and continued mental health services. So one of the things that we did as part of our partnership was develop a couple of flowcharts, and one having to do with education and other services, and another having to do with employment. And the reason why we did this was that, as I said, we're a large county, there's a lot of agencies involved, and it wasn't always clear who was supposed to be involved with the youth, with moving them from being in the juvenile camps to the community, and how that would work. So one of the flow charts that we did early on, you see here, and I because it's sort of hard to see, I've sort of written it out on the next slide. But so this was the education, primarily education, other services, and this is what's on it. And I'm just going to focus on a couple of aspects of it, that when youth enter, there's notices, but what's particularly important was this initial multidisciplinary camp meeting that would happen between 10 to 14 days of their arrival. Okay, and then that would include probation officers, coordinators within the juvenile camps, the education agency, mental health as appropriate, Department of Health Services, a nurse might attend as well. And then there are a number of services and things that would happen. And then I want to focus you on between 45 to 60 days before their release, there would be a transitional multidisciplinary team meeting. And so at this one, there would be an aftercare probation officer who would be there, as well as the probation officer from the camp. There'd be the Department of Mental Health representative. There'd be the County Office of Education representative from the camp. And then if they were going to go back into Los Angeles Unified School District, so even though we have 81 school districts in the county, Los Angeles Unified is the largest. Los Angeles Unified might be at this meeting. We'd have a nurse from the Department of Health Services, certainly the coordinator of the team, the youth would be there, as well as the youth's parents or guardians. And there would be a number of referrals made to services that the youth would need once they leave the camp. Once they left, once they were back in the community, there would be some engagement with them within 1 to 3 days. There'd be an implementation treatment plan, including the support services. They were supposed to be enrolled in school within 2 to 3 days. and the County Office of Education, their transition counselors, would follow up periodically with them to make sure that they were in school. And then there'd be some reinforcement of that transition plan. So let me tell you about the data that were collected to see whether we were achieving our goals and whether the flowcharts were helping. So we decided to collect youth data on 75 youth. These were, at the time, 35 youth and young adults who were in the juvenile camps as of January 2018. And then there were 40 as of that date who had been released to the community. They were all from 2 different units within the juvenile camps, and those who were excluded were those who had severe mental health problems, and they would have been housed in particular camps devoted to their needs. And then those who were below stage 3 and part of the behavior management system, because they would not be eligible for the work experience, for the personal enrichment training and the work experience. So these are a snapshot of the youth who we were following, who we collected data on to see what would happen. So all of them, and this was the whole population of these youth at that time, they were all youth of color. There were 43% of the 75 who were Hispanic, and that's how they were identified for us. So this Hispanic, a Latinx population. And then there were 47% who are Black or African American. In terms of LA County population, the 53% Hispanic was fairly close to the LA County population. The 47% of Black older youth and young adults was highly disproportionate. We have somewhere between 7 and 9% of African Americans who would be in this population. We had mostly males, so 97% were male. There were only 9% were female, which was 7 females. And by the time we looked at the data, which was 2019, the average age was 19 years old. So this is the age range. So even though the average range was 19, there was actually no one who was 19 years old at the time, but they ranged from 16 years old to 22 years old. In terms of the population, the 75, 33.3% had been identified for special education. So that is fairly accurate of what we see within the juvenile justice population. 21% were English learners. And in terms of California, our English learner population is about 19%, a little higher, I think, in LA County. So this is about right for LA County and for California. And so here are some of the outcomes. In terms of those who received a high school diploma or equivalency as of December 2019, 52% of the 75, so 39 of them, had received a high school diploma or equivalency. 64% of them, or 25, had been in the camps. Those were the 35 who had been in the juvenile camps when our study started. 36% were in the community already. This is statistically significant difference between these two populations. And we're certainly not sure exactly what it's attributed to. It may be because there were a higher percentage of African Americans in the community population, higher percentage of those who had been identified for special education in the community population, or it may be that some of those in the camp, that flowchart had been put in place, and so the system may have been working a little better for those who were in the camp when we started the project. Those who had not received their high school diploma was 48% of the 75, or 36. 10 had been in the camp at the time that the study started. And so about four of them were probably too young to have their high school diploma already when we looked at this data. But those in the community, those 26 or 72% certainly were old enough to have had it by this time. So in terms of looking at who actually received their high school diploma, only 28% of those who had been identified for special education received a high school diploma, compared to 72% of those who were not identified as special ed. Only 18% of those who were English learners received their high school diploma or equivalency, compared to 82% of those who are non-English learners. Some additional data that we had to do with grade equivalency scores in mathematics and in reading. And so we looked at this in terms of the special education populations and the English learner populations. In terms of the special ed populations, actually, there was a significant difference, statistically significant difference, related to math equivalency scores for special ed and non-special ed, with special ed being lower. And as you can see here, the non-special education populations, the major cluster was at 11th grade, although there certainly was quite a spread. And for those who were special ed eligible, it was at the 4th grade level. Again, certainly a spread over grade level equivalency. For reading, that again, the non-special ed were clustered around the 11th grade level, where the special education population was fairly well distributed across grade levels from 3rd grade through 12th grade. So with the English learner population, there was a statistically significant difference in the area of grade level scores in reading. And so the English those who are English learners were much lower than those who were non-English learners. And non-English learners, again, their reading scores clustered around the 11th grade level, with, again, a fairly wide spread. But for the English learners, it was, across all grade levels from 3 through 11. And with math, again, those who are not English learners did much better than those who were English learners. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to the employment data. And as I said, our original goal, we had wanted, had hoped that we could show that for those who had received their high school diploma or equivalency, that 45% of them would attain employment. And as it turned out, only 9.5% actually attained employment. So we've got 90.5% had not. Of those who had not, that there were 6 that were in employment program and training, and 3 had employment but were not currently employed when we looked at the data as of May 2020. And those who had attained employment, even though the numbers were really small, they're fairly well distributed. 4 had been in the camp, 3 were in the community, but most of them were neither special education nor English learners. So here is another flow chart that we did. And again, I've got this written out so that you can see it better on the next slide. But with one of the things that some of the other partnerships they really were intrigued by our flow charts, and we did share them with some of the other partners. So again, I'm not going to go over all of this, but the reason that there was a need for the flow charts where there was a lot of agencies involved, a lot of steps from these older youth, young adults being detained in the camp till the time they left and got connected to the employment agencies within the community. So there's the identification of them once they're in camp by the education service staff, which is probation staff in the camp, as well as the deputy probation officer, which was the camp probation officer. They have to have eligibility documents, so their social security numbers that they need. They also need information about their high school credits. So the probation staff starts establishing this. The workforce development staff then comes in and has to establish eligibility and enroll them into the program. And we've got others who are involved in this to finally that they start this personal enrichment training, which they can get up to 20 hours, which is the soft skills, financial literacy, work ethics, how you dress for work, writing resumes, setting goals, all of those things. Once that's done, and again, there's some days and weeks involved, then they were able to get 100 hours of work experience paid within the camps. Within the camps that can start, they could finish that once they're released to the community. So these are a lot of the steps in order for them to finally be in the community and be connected to the proper agencies and the representatives, which turned out to be quite a difficult process. And there were a lot of steps along the way that things could go wrong, essentially, that referrals could be lost, that representatives in the community could try to contact the youth wouldn't respond, and so that would be the end rather than any follow through. So we tried to deal with some of that. So I want to talk now just a little bit about some of the changes that occurred as part of this process. Again, we were trying to improve equity for these older youth, young adult by improving their education and employment outcomes. So we certainly identified a lot of procedures that were not in place related to the employment outcomes that even probation at this point initially thought that the Workforce Development Agency was actually going to get them jobs. And the Workforce Development Agency, actually their agreement was that they would do the personal enrichment training and work experience. So we tried to put some more procedures in place to try and make the process work more smoothly. As I said, we developed the flow charts. There was training that took place on these flow charts. The referral system from probation through the Workforce Development Agency had been a paper referral system, and so it became automated. There were still some problems with it by the time the project ended, but that seemed to be a better process than what happened before. What we also did was we had a training that brought together the probation officers and the workforce development or representatives in the community that would be working with the same youth. They had never really worked together, even though they were working in the same geographic community. As I said, Los Angeles is large, and so there were different geographic communities. We brought them together, they got to know each other, and had some training related to improving their outcomes working with this population. We also started having the workforce development representatives start coming to the juvenile camps and actually making in-person connections with them while they were still detained in the camps, so that they would have the relationship once they left. So that was a good process, but then the pandemic hit, and they no longer could enter the camps. They were not letting any additional people in at that point, so that they were trying to make the connections remotely. There also was a plan to hire math coaches. This was the County Office of Education was going to put that in place, realizing that that was an area of particular need. But again, because of the pandemic hitting, that was put on hold. So some final thoughts before I end, that the number of youth detained or incarcerated have been decreasing nationwide fairly significantly, and so that's very important. However, there still continues to be disproportionate representation of youth of color and youth who have been identified as special education. There is a need for further research related to how to improve high school graduation and employment rates of this particular population, of those who are released from juvenile detention facilities, particularly youth of color, those who have been identified for special education, and for English learners. And English learners has actually been a fairly under-researched population so far. So that's really necessary, and some strategies, right, to assess these youth, to assess their skills, and work on their areas of need so that they're more likely to graduate from high school. Certainly, obstacles remain with multi-agency involvement, even with best efforts at collaboration. And the group of these agencies in Los Angeles County that were collaborating well. Everyone wanted to make a difference. They wanted the best for the youth. But even so, because they were different agencies, it sometimes was very difficult. And what's also important, and what some of the research does show, is that once youth are released from juvenile detention, that's what's important are really targeted interventions for them and for their families if needed. And this needs to be ongoing, sometimes ongoing for a number of years, and that it's also important that there are people that connect with these youth or older youth and young adults who they feel a connection to, that they feel understand them and are going to stick with them. And so those are some of the features that are needed for success. So again, I want to say that the contents of this presentation don't necessarily represent the Department of Education, and one should not assume endorsement by the federal government. So I want to thank you for this presentation, and I look forward to any communication with anyone who wants further information.